Hey friends, thanks for joining me on another episode of Embracing Your Season. My name is Paige Clingenpeel and I am your host. Today is an extra special episode because not only do I have one of my best friends joining me today, it is also the week of Thanksgiving. So we want to give a big shout out, happy Thanksgiving, and to all the holidays that are coming up. So today joining me is Tiffany Gardner. She is the Engaged Director at Pine Hills Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana. That's how we actually became dear friends. She is a world traveler, over 20 countries she has visited. She has helped to establish new churches, train leaders, and equip pastors, and improve the quality of life in all the areas of the families that she gets to interact with globally. Here in Fort Wayne with me, she is a full-time minister. She is training and equipping church leaders as well as locals in global and local outreach opportunities. But most importantly, she is my best friend. And so we get to have a conversation today about navigating the holidays, which I know you will benefit from. So stay tuned and listen to an amazing episode of Embracing Your Season. Tiffany, I'm so excited that you're joining me today on Embrace Your Season. You have helped me just navigate not only where we're at with this podcast, but some of the questions we're going to discuss here today is what we discuss on our own, right?
Yeah.
At lunch and via text message. We're big Marco Polo people. I love that. I love having conversations. So I get to see your beautiful face. Definitely enjoyed talking. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm super excited to be here. I feel like it doesn't really feel like a podcast episode because we're always, like you said, talking about this, and it's just going to be fun and casual. And these are the conversations that we already have. So I'm super excited to be here.
I love that. I love that. So let's dig in.
Yeah.
We are talking about the holidays, particularly Thanksgiving is coming up.
Yes.
So that means for us and for people that are listening, there's going to be time for extended family gatherings.
Yeah.
We know that sometimes that's amazing. Like for me, for instance, I just bought an amazing game. It's where you tie a tail around yourself and then you're supposed to like loop it through these like arch things. It's going to be amazing. We're going to take videos because we're going to look ridiculous, right?
You always find the craziest games. I don't even know where you would go to search for something like that. I don't know if they find you or you find them, but
it's
I believe
a mix.
that
There's an algorithm out there. I'm pretty sure that says
they're like, Paige, she'll love this game.
I know.
This is for her.
I know. So we'll definitely take videos. We're going to have to show everyone how amazing it is. So there's fun that happens from family gatherings, you know, and there's some blessings in that. But there's also some stressors that happen. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about, from your wisdom, what are some stressors or hesitations about going into family gatherings?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it depends a lot on the family that you have, right? And what that looks like. So that's different for everybody. Some people like spend as much time as they can with family, right? Like they're there even on weekends or even outside of holidays. But for others, as we've talked about, there are stressors or just maybe even triggers as you think about spending time with extended family over the holidays. And I think some of those could be stepping back into maybe a situation where expectations are different than what current expectations you have for yourself. So sometimes family has, just different expectations of you than what you hold for yourself. And so it can be hard to navigate that, stepping back into a space where you've grown or you've changed or you're in a different season or you view yourself differently than maybe they do. And so navigating that of how do I kind of reset expectations in my home of this is for not only yourself, but maybe your family as well. When you're bringing your kids back into that space of these are the expectations and boundaries that I've set up for my family.
That's good.
That can look different because with grandparents or whatever, you know, entering into that space, they might have different, just expectations for your kids and for their grandkids and what that looks like. I think for some people entering back into their home is maybe a space where they don't feel comfortable or don't feel freedom to be their authentic selves. And so that's a stressor because you're constantly maybe monitoring how you're being perceived or, there could be conflict or tension that you're entering into where maybe beliefs don't align. And so holidays can bring that out of discussing a variety of topics. We always know the families that love to talk about politics.
Oh gosh. Yep.
Yeah. So that's a stressor of just thinking, okay, I don't align with, if I don't align with their beliefs, like how are those conversations going to go and how can we have healthy conversations around that, which again, depending on the background of your family, not everybody knows how to have healthy conversations around conflict and tension and all of those things. So I think those are just a few, stressors when you think about, spending extended time, right, with family, because it can be a shorter amount of time, but holidays are usually a little bit longer and can be a little more intense. And there's stress even just around the whole production of the holiday, right? Of the meal and all of those. So you add all those things together and it can either be a beautiful reunion or a perfect storm, I think. So
no, I love that. I love that perception. So you had talked about, or you had mentioned briefly about how sometimes extended family think they know who you are.
Yeah.
But in reality, they don't. So can you speak a little bit more into that?
Yeah, I think the temptation can be, and this can really be in any relationship. I don't think it's necessarily just with like a parent-child relationship, but I think as people grow and relationships grow, you grow with that person, or you kind of adapt and you learn and grow with them, because people change. In fact, you should be changing. That's a sign of health, right? Yeah. We don't want to remain stagnant. And so I think for some families, it can be a challenge when you feel like you know your kid at whatever stage that you're connecting with them. And then they start getting older and their maybe personality starts shifting a little bit, or they're changing, they're growing, they're thinking for themselves, they're expanding their worldview, whatever that looks like, especially during the teenage years. And as they get older, you have to adapt to that, right? And so I think when families don't do that, or parents don't do that, it creates that distance between the parent and child, to the point where the parent isn't consistently trying to get to know their child as they're growing.
Yeah.
And so then it feels like, as the child would feel like, my parents don't know me. So then they're connecting in other ways. They're connecting to friends, they're connecting to hopefully other trusted adults, but you just never know what then they're finding that connection and that intimacy and that care in other places, because they don't feel like their home maybe is a safe place for their family, because they don't feel understood. They don't feel known. They don't feel pursued in the relationship. And just like any other relationship, like even in our friendship, you pursue getting to know the person. You never fully know the person, right? And that's the beauty of relationship, is that you're always pursuing getting to know them more. And so I think when you stop doing that as a parent, no matter what age your child is, because if you feel confident, you just know them fully.
Right.
Yeah, that can be, I think, dangerous. And that can be actually create distance where you feel like you have this close intimacy because you know your child so well, when they might have a completely different perception because they don't feel like you've pursued them in getting to know them as they've developed and changed over the years.
Yeah. And it's making me think, like, when does this start happening as a parent of my child becoming their own person? And I think I even wrote like a blog post a long time ago when my first child, she's now in high school. But she was, I think, going into middle school, or she was in upper elementary. And I remember thinking, like, she had a life outside of me. Yeah. That she was making friends. She was having experiences. She was growing in who she was. And I was not always privy to some of that information. And so I think for me, that was a moment of, there was grief, because this is my baby girl who used to come to me on everything, and almost to that point where you're like, okay, girl, you need to kind of handle this yourself. I don't need to know all the details. But then it just hit me that she is growing up, and I believe that is health, because we are designed to go from our families and then to unite with our spouse and to create that unity in that family system with our partner and then subsequently our kids. And so there is this autonomy that we want for our kids to develop, but yet there's this grief piece for parents of like, but wait, that means they're separating from me. And so I get this grief, but at the same time, I would love to see parents celebrate that their kids are their own person. And I think you even mentioned this, is like asking questions, pursuing them, getting to know them. And just because you have the role of parent does not necessarily guarantee intimacy in that relationship.
That's good.
I think that's super powerful, that parents need to understand that it doesn't always make equity in the relationship because you're the parent.
Yeah.
And the more that parents try to convince themselves of their role equaling this intimacy, I think is going to create more disconnection.
Oh yeah,
ultimately.
Absolutely. Because I think what you're speaking to is proximity is not equivalent to intimacy.
That is right.
And so if you're, just because you're in, and we see this, and you probably have experiences at different levels, just because you're in the same space as someone or you spend a lot of time with them doesn't necessarily automatically create that intimacy. There's intentionality that comes with intimacy. And to your point, that's pursuing, that's asking those questions. But I'd be interested to hear from your perspective, just like what what are those different roles when you're, as your parent or as your child, grows and gets older? Like, what roles do you feel like you've had to shift in as a parent, and what does that look like? And how do you like make sure you're navigating that and not staying stuck in one role as like, the whatever, if it's the, caretaker as they're, when they're little to, whatever, as they grow and develop, like how have you seen that played out with your kiddos, and what does that look like?
Yeah, no, that's such a good, I think place to start of just reflection of how have I also grown as a parent and how that does change. And I think there's value in representing all those different roles. And then what hopefully will turn into as my kids become young adults. But in the beginning, my gosh, when they were infants, like they were attached to me, right? Like physically and emotionally and everything. And to the point, and those mamas out there right now that can't even shower by themselves or go to the bathroom by themselves, like that phase does change. You do grow out of that. There is
Praise the Lord, right?
Yeah. It's gonna happen. It will get better, I promise. And it is awesome because again, that there's no love like you have that for your kiddos. And so there is something special. But as they start getting older, I think I started allowing them the opportunity to make more choices on their own. So instead of just dictating to them, you will eat this, you will do this, you will wear this, I started really empowering my kids to choose things for themselves. I think there's a lot of value, and even as they're little, to pick their clothing, pick their outfits. And I know that seems so little and benign, but actually it's powerful for them because we are now showing our kids that they have not only autonomy, but they have a voice and they have an identity outside of me as their parent. And so that starts building up for them their confidence that they can make those choices. So it starts with that. And then it grows into a managerial position where instead we're overseeing, we're setting guidelines and boundaries. We're in the teenager years and preteen years. And so for them, they've kind of already established what their likes are and their dislikes are. And I love that we get to have those conversations, even daily, that, I mean, I'm not always equipped to know what they're liking and disliking because culture changes so fast.
Right.
It changes so quickly. But for me, I'm setting those guardrails so that they still have structure, they still have rules, and there will be consequences in my home, but that is out of love. And I teach them, this is out of love, but I want you to speak into this as well. I want you to speak into, what do you think the guidelines should be? I even ask my kids, what do you think the consequences should be? They sometimes come up with some really amazing ones. And other times they're like, yeah, I shouldn't have a consequence because of this. I was like, yeah, this will be a conversation.
That's not an option.
Yeah, this isn't going to go this way. Right.
Yeah,
exactly right. So it has changed from being when they were infants and toddlers, where you are literally almost attached to them, to allowing them to make their own choices. And in that, I have gotten to know them at a different level. And I have expressed to them that they now have to have more responsibility in what they're choosing to do, assessing even their values and designing what they are hoping to do something in their future. I can't dictate that for them. And I've recognized my role. There's grief in that still, because these are my babies and they'll always be my babies. And I want what's best for them. But I've been able to learn more about them because I've created this opportunity for them to be autonomous from me and making their own decisions.
Yeah, I love that. I love that even in the couple examples you used, it's like embracing their independence, like celebrating that instead of that feeling like a threat.
Yes.
I think some parents like view independence as like, oh my gosh, they don't need me anymore, when that's more about a need that you're trying to get fulfilled through your kids, instead of embracing that, hey, I am raising them to be independent.
That's right.
That's a beautiful thing. Like, I'm raising them to make their own choices and to bring them into the conversation about their consequences or the structure that you're developing, so that in the future, hopefully they come to you because they know that their voice is valued, that their opinion it matters, so that when they are processing something or they're trying to make a decision, then they know that that is something that is already welcomed and that it was honored when even they were younger. Knowing that, like you said, they don't always get maybe what they're desiring when they voice their opinion. That doesn't mean that they get, whatever they want, but it still opens that door for conversation. And I think that that's a beautiful thing, because then when we talk about the stressors of holidays and kids wanting, and as you become adults, wanting to come home for the holidays versus doing it out of a forced obligation or a forced expectation,
that is right.
Like that starts at a young age. I think so many parents now are trying to fix that and mend that a little bit of, my kids never want to, come see me, or they don't want to come visit. And not that it can't be fixed in the present, but the work, if you can do the hard work on the front end when they're littles and as they're growing up, to always have that space where then, they want to come, they want to spend time, with their family. And it's an exciting thing to come home. It's not a stressor or the things that they're thinking through. I think that's good.
Yeah, I love that, because we do want our kids to come home. We do value that relationship so desperately, but we don't want it out of obligation.
Right.
Yeah.
No.
We want to build up that friendship.
For either one, because with usually the child at that point is not going to want to share that of like, hey, I'm only coming home because I feel like I have to. I don't desire that.
Can you imagine that conversation?
Not going to go well. So they're not able to voice that. And so then the parent might not even know that that's the position that this person is in. And so then it just, continues to create that tension, and it doesn't feel like that's in because they weren't raised maybe with having that open door to be able to share their thoughts or where they were at or what they were thinking, or that wasn't welcomed, their independence. So then it's harder to be able to have that conversation and navigate that. So
yeah. So let's talk about boundaries. So we're talking about extended families. So in this case, it's purely outside of the immediate family. And everyone has, especially grandparents, they have opinions, they have cousins, everybody. So what is it that we can do, maybe as a preventative instead of a reactionary, to help create healthy boundaries for our family going into maybe extended family gatherings?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I am still currently learning.
Okay, so we'll explore this together.
Yeah, we will explore this together, and I might defer to the expert in the room, which would be you in this. But yeah, I think for me, the first step has been to actually allow myself to consider boundaries and that it's a healthy thing. I think for my context, boundaries was not really a conversation that was ever had. In fact, I would probably say boundaries was something that it feels a little foreign. Like, why it feels unhealthy. Like, why would you have boundaries with the people that are closest to you? That feels counter to the culture that I was raised in, the family culture that I was raised in. And so, as an adult, having to process through that boundaries are healthy, that it's a good process that you have to walk through and you have to identify what those are, has been challenging, but it's been really good and it's been healthy. I think once you establish maybe what those boundaries need to be, I think what the challenge can be then, and maybe you can speak more to this, is how do you have a conversation with the person that you're creating boundaries with, especially maybe if that person is not open to the boundary or doesn't really consider boundaries to be healthy. Like if you're trying to come from the perspective or have a discussion with someone where the concept of boundaries is not even something that they are thinking about, nor do they think they need boundaries. Because sometimes in extended family, they're like, why would we need boundaries? Everything's going great. Everything's fine. And you're like, this is a mess. Like I need a lot of boundaries for my own mental health, for my own family's health, walking into this space. So how do you navigate those conversations with people that are maybe not open to the concept of boundaries, or it feels counter to the health that they think or perceive is in their family unit already? How do you navigate that? Yeah,
that's such a nuanced question and answer, because it is specific. I think, the first thing that I think needs to be established is why do you feel like boundaries are necessary? Once you establish the foundation of this is to keep me emotionally safe, this is to help me not have toxic relationship with family members, you have to establish the why. Once you establish the why, then it helps inform the way that you interact from there on out. But I think I love your statement of boundaries are so important. We have to have boundaries. In fact, Christians, I think, have a skewed view of what boundaries are. And I think we forget to see that Jesus represented this well. He had boundaries in relationship. In fact, there are many times in the Bible where he demonstrates walking away from people that were persecutory or that were condemning or frankly just didn't listen. He gave them an opportunity. And so then he walked away. He also had boundaries to find rest, and he needed to avoid the crowds where he just hung out with his core people. So I think it's well demonstrated in the Bible that boundaries are actually very important. And this was represented by the Son of God, right? So we can learn from that. So first, establishing why is your boundary important. Getting specific with that. I think practicing it out loud is another really important feature, either sharing it with trusted people and say, how does this sound? Do you think this is appropriate? Is this boundary realistic? Or am I just responding to a trigger of unreconciliation? Because if we're unreconciled with someone, or if we're in unforgiveness with someone, of course, that's going to create tension in that relationship. We have to then walk alongside that situation, circumstance, and say, what do I need to own in this? And what do I need to reconcile? And frankly, there's going to be times where you don't need to own that. Forgiveness is important, and you can forgive and still not reconcile. But that's a different podcast altogether. So again, recognizing what do I own in this situation, establishing what the boundaries are and why they're important. And then when expressing them to that family member, I think this is super, super key. You can apologize for how it makes them feel, but do not own their emotion. So oftentimes we as natural people pleasers, which I struggle with this to a degree, I want to apologize to them for having a boundary. We can't do that, because now we're just saying that my worth and value, my needs aren't worth anything because the other person has an emotional reaction to that. We can't allow that. Instead, we can say, I am sorry if this hurts you. I am sorry if this grieves you or makes you sad, because you're not going to get to see me as much, or we're not going to interact as much. But don't apologize for the boundary itself. Lean into the emotion. Recognize that they probably just want a relationship with you. They don't know how to have that. And so that adds grace and love, but communicate it clearly and concisely, and then follow through. I think those are all really important things. The
hardest part is the follow through. And I think it's, to your point, it's so important. I think sometimes, and even I've tried to process this with others, of like, well, can't I just create a boundary and I just know the boundary and like I just try to uphold it because I don't want to have that conversation with the person that I'm creating the boundary with. I'm just like, I'll keep I know the boundary. I'll be careful. And that's not honoring to the other person. I think it becomes then confusing, because if you are creating distance or whatever the results of the boundary are, they're experiencing that boundary without knowing that you set it. And so then they're interpreting that in a lot of different ways. That's causing more tension. And then my natural tendency is to continue to back off if there's more tension happening. So it just snowballs from there. So I think that's so important, to your point of like, you have to have the hard conversation. And it is a hard conversation, especially if the other person doesn't feel the need for a boundary. Like, it's great when both people are like on the same page and they're like, yes, this is for the health of the relationship. We get it. Let's move forward with this, which very rarely I find that both people feel that need for that boundary sometimes, but usually it's one person feeling the need for the boundary and then having to have that discussion. But I think it's, to your point, clearly communicating that in a way that isn't diminishing your need for it, but is still, identifying like, hey, this is something that I need. And I think what becomes hard is when that person doesn't want to accept it. Like, to your point, following through on that boundary, even though the other person is like, no, I don't see the need for that. I don't want to follow that. Like, sticking with it.
And then what tends to happen is that reaction, not only the tension, but we're starting to get the passive aggressive, or we go full blown confrontation. So it's like, how do we respond to that? And I think one of my biggest recommendations is to just have that conversation and say, I'm noticing you're doing this, or can you help me understand why you said this? And so hopefully they'll admit to that. And if they don't, then you point out your own perceptions or understanding of what you're seeing is happening. Not so much of saying, I see you do this, because that other person can become defensive. Instead, I would recommend saying things like, I feel this way when you say this, or I interpreted your behavior as meaning this. That opens up the dialogue of saying, but am I correct? Am I right in seeing you in doing this for this reason? Again, not trying to diagnose what their behaviors or motivations are, but rather speak to that. So any thoughts on that regard?
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think sometimes potentially people reject boundaries. There's usually a root there, right? Like, I think sometimes even asking like, why are you so opposed to this boundary? Or what is this making you feel, or how are you interpreting this, or what is this triggering for you? Because there's clearly something there. If someone is so opposed to the boundary, there's maybe a need that you're fulfilling in their life that's maybe unhealthy, and you shouldn't be fulfilling that need. And so I think asking those good questions of just that are open-ended, that are not accusatory, to your point, that pushes people into defensiveness or whatever that is, but just asking the open-ended question of like, hey, I'm sensing a lot of, pushback or, about this boundary. What is that coming from? Do you know where that's coming from? Like, why does this boundary make you so upset? we work through that? How can we identify maybe what some of those roots are of feeling, the need to be fulfilled? Like there's relationships in my life where a boundary actually creates, it pushes into their sense of worth, where if I have a boundary with them, then their worth is wrapped up in being able to care for and fulfill the needs of me that I don't want those needs fulfilled in that way. And so me creating that boundary is actually pressing into their self-worth and their identity and who they are. And so they're rejecting that boundary or pushing against it and not thinking that it's even needed because they don't want to identify this is wrecking my identity because my identity is in the wrong thing.
It's a threat.
It's 100% a threat. And so being able to recognize maybe those things or try to identify that or play the conversation, like you said, with others and with yourself of when I have this conversation about the boundary, what maybe is going to be the response and where is that coming from? Because if I can get to more of the root of the matter and try to talk through that, potentially the response might be a little bit better if there's an openness and a willingness for that person to receive that and at least have a conversation about it of like, hey, do you think this might be from, something deeper here? Like, where do you think this is coming from? And get to the root.
That's good. Yeah. We all have inner motivations and roots behind our behavior. So if we can help identify them, not only in ourselves again, but to ask questions to allow other people to explore that so we can understand them better.
Yeah.
I mean, that's loving them well.
100%.
Right?
Yeah. And things just, generationally, things get passed down too. So if you're coming up against something in your family, like a boundary that you're having to set that has generationally not been something that has been present, like you're not just coming up against the generation, the parent or whoever you're talking to have that boundary. You're going up against what has been known for generations, right? So your parent has only known that. Their parent has only known that. And so you're trying to break something that has been considered healthy and the norm, and they don't know any different. And so, keeping that in mind too of like, sometimes it's not super simple. It gets really complicated if it's something that you're like, hey, I'm trying to break something here that has been for generations. And I want new health for my family when I have family visits with my extended family. Like, I don't want that same pattern to be, played out in my family and how I interact with my kids and all of that.
Good.
Yeah.
And I love the fact that it goes back to you're not doing this alone, right? Hopefully you're doing it with your partner and you both have established this is our desire for our immediate family. And so then you're not coming up against all the power of these generations before by yourself. So there is value in that. And those are important conversations to have, whether in your dating life or early in marriage, because it does change when you go and you become married outside of the family context of extended families. So I love that point. I know within my own family, both my husband and I, we have stopped some generational things from continuing happening. And I am just so thankful for that. And it's not like we come from super dysfunctional families, but there are elements that we don't want to raise our kids
There's
in.
dysfunction in any family. So I think it's not a bad thing to identify that. Even in your own family, there are going to be things that your kids grow up with and is like, that was dysfunctional. I want to break that. Like as much as you try, there's going to be those things. And so, I think if you're intentional at identifying them and not being defensive about that they're there so that you can, work through them. And I love even what you talked about of like bringing your partner into those like conversations. I think it could even be helpful to have, like if you're having a hard conversation about a boundary with a parent or whoever, having your spouse there with you because they're able to know you well and they might be an objective person in it. And so if they feel like you're responding emotionally or you're being triggered or whatever, where you're maybe escalating the tension or, you're responding because of how the other person is responding, they can maybe step in and just be like, hey, this is not as, helpful, or try to mitigate that a little bit and just bring it back to more of that healthy, rational conversations, because your emotions are going to be involved. Because at the end of the day, these are people that you care about, that love you and that you love them. And if you're having a conversation about a boundary, it's usually because you do love them and you want a relationship with them. Otherwise, you wouldn't have any boundaries. You'd be out of the relationship altogether. So the fact that you're wanting to create boundaries shows that I want to stay in relationship with you. I just need to do it in a healthy way that's healthy for me and for us to continue the relationship. And so emotions will be involved, especially depending on how the other person responds. And so having someone that's kind of that third party that knows you well, that knows when you're getting either fired up or like, okay, that's not going to be helpful if you say that, like, don't go down that road, or, just can help navigate that a little bit, I think is super healthy.
Wow, this is really good content. These are great conversations to have, but When do you think is the right time to actually have these conversations? Should we have these next week for Thanksgiving?
Probably not. It's not going to be probably the promoting thankfulness environment that you're maybe wanting to have. Yeah, I think you start thinking about these conversations in those moments when you're having holiday gatherings and when some of the tensions or the conflicts or the things, the stressors that you're experiencing come up in those contexts. So naturally, the temptation is going to be I need to address it now. And usually if you're at that point, you're reactionary and you're not being thoughtful and thinking about what you want to say and how you actually want to have an intentional conversation. So I think it's important to lean into in that moment, okay, of like, what am I feeling? What boundary do I feel like is being crossed that I maybe haven't had a conversation about? It helps you inform and articulate in your mind, what conversation do I need to have? But I think the moment for that conversation is not in a moment of conflict or tension or when these stressors arise, but then taking a step back and then actually like scheduling something or having an intentional space to be like, I want to talk to you about this. Not as a reaction to something that you experienced, but just this is in general, because that could maybe allow for the person to be more open to hearing that anyway, because it doesn't feel like they don't have to isolate it to one incident, where in the moment, if you're addressing it, they could just try to justify whatever that incident that sparked the conflict versus this is not one incident. And boundaries probably, unless it's a major incident, boundaries shouldn't be established just as a one-time event. It should be patterns, things that you're seeing that you're saying, okay, we need to create a boundary about this. So when you have that conversation separate from whatever stressor or thing that triggered it, it allows for a more comprehensive conversation to say that, hey, this is a pattern that I need to set a boundary for. This isn't because of one item or one thing that happened, one incident. So I think it's just, healthier to remove yourself from that and knowing when you need space in holiday. It's okay during the holidays, next week, Thanksgiving, be like, I'm going to take a drive or I need to go to a different room or, whatever that might be, like space.
Turn on the football game really loud.
Yes.
Can't hear you, Grandma.
That's right. So sorry, you're drowning out. Yeah. Or just stepping out of the kitchen, can't cook with your mom anymore, whatever it is, right?
Yes.
Like just, needing that space is okay. But I would say remove yourself from the situation before inserting your words into the situation. That's can be a little more.
That's so smart. Gosh. Well, this is great. I think this is really going to be impactful for people entering into the holiday season and having good conversations. But as you even pointed out, like making sure that you are mindful of the timing of these conversations. So just being, just aware of what your needs are, your boundaries, have conversation with your spouse. What do you want to enforce and how do you want to do that in a loving, caring way, grace-filled way. And so I think this could be really great to create a happy holiday season, right?
It's challenged me. I'm already thinking of like, okay, what are conversations I need to have, right? And that's a good reminder for that.
Good stuff. Well, Tiff, I love talking with you. Again, we have these conversations all the time, but I'm glad that we get to share them with others and people get to walk away with practical wisdom. So thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, super fun. Thanks for having me.
Okay, everybody, I know that you have enjoyed this episode of Embracing Your Season. Again, I just want to give a big shout out to Tiffany Gardner. She is so wise, isn't she? The things that she talks about, it just blows my mind, the wisdom that she has. So some takeaways that I know that you would like to have. Maybe you can even implement this week in your conversation, especially as we're gearing up for the holiday season. First one is getting to know your child at all ages as they develop and grow into an independent adult. We know that they are our kids and we get to see them every day and how they're growing into their individuality autonomously, as well as relationships that they're building with other people outside of our home. But sometimes we forget that they are their own person and that our perception of who they are might be slightly different than who they actually are. So we as parents have to remain curious. We have to ask a lot of open questions about who they are, what they like, what their values are. In previous Embracing Your Season episodes, we've talked with authors and experts about having some of these conversations. So definitely check those out as well, as they provide great tools and wisdom of how to open up a conversation about getting to know your kid and connecting well with them. We talked a little bit about how we want to celebrate their individuality and that our roles will change as well. So continue to check those out of all the resources that we have available at Embracing Your Season, as well as many other authors and speakers like Dr. Jim Burns and his books. The next takeaway is boundaries are healthy. Okay, maybe you grew up in a family where boundaries weren't necessarily discovered or talked about. We are here today to tell you that boundaries are actually very important. They establish health in relationships, and it might be a little hard to establish what those are and what is realistic and what is healthy. And so I truly encourage you to explore what are healthy boundaries in relationships, both inside your marriage, outside your marriage, and across the board in any relationship that you have. You can do that by talking to trusted people that you have in your life. You can hit up a therapist. You can talk to a mentor or an advisor. I'm sure that you can find people that can speak wisdom into what are healthy boundaries that you can have. Once you establish that healthy boundaries are important for your relationships, why don't you start coming up with a plan of how to implement those? So holidays, great example of how we need to start implementing boundaries, especially when we're talking about things that maybe you're uncomfortable with, or your in-laws or your own parents start trying to dictate to you how to parent yourself, right? These are great places to implement boundaries. But you got to have a plan. First, establish what is the boundary that you want to stick with. If you have a partner, talking with your partner about what those should look like. Secondly, how do we communicate our boundaries in a kind, loving, but firm way? And then thirdly, how do we follow through? Those all three together can be a great and healthy conversation to have because you want to maintain those relationships. That's why we have boundaries. If we didn't care about the relationship, then we would probably just walk away and not try to develop it or maintain it. Instead, we want it to be healthy. So remember that boundaries are actually a way that we can love our extended family or love the people we're in relationship with, but we have to do it in the right way. Thirdly, when we have these conversations about boundaries, choosing the right timing. Yes, this may mean that you cannot drop the bomb of having boundary conversations during the Thanksgiving meal. Maybe you need to write it down prior to, when things aren't heightened, when people aren't going to be as easily defensive. That way you could just speak to it as a generality instead of a specific circumstance that can cause people to become more defensive in the way that they respond to you. So being very intentional about choosing your timing wisely is going to be really important. And then lastly, what if you are receiving this conversation? What if your kids are coming to you, or your neighbors or your friends are coming to you about wanting to establish boundaries in your relationship? Of course, that can hurt a little bit. It can sting to have this conversation brought to you. But we need to be mindful. They're doing it because they want a relationship with us. They want to maintain this. And so we get to honor them by listening, potentially even asking conversation or asking questions so we can have clarity to what they're asking of us, and just receiving it in humility, reminding ourselves that we value them enough that we can respect their boundaries, therefore have a healthy family relationship. I hope those takeaways were really great for you, because I know they were for me as well. Thanks again for joining us for Embracing Your Season. We appreciate you tuning in. Make sure you tune in next week as we continue to have amazing guests to speak into wisdom of how we can make healthy families.